Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Kalpana Sharma, Associate Professor, Department of Zoology, S.P.C. Government College, Ajmer. बच्चों, आज मैं आप लोगों को BSc पार्ट 1 का सेल बायोलॉजी के पेपर के अंदर सेल मेम्ब्रेन या कोशिका झिल्ली के बारे में बताने जा रही हूँ। सबसे पहले हम देखेंगे कि व्हाट इज सेल मेम्ब्रेन, कोशिका झिल्ली क्या होती है। द सेल मेम्ब्रेन, also known as the plasma membrane, is a double layer of lipid and proteins that surrounds a cell. It separates the cytoplasm from the external environment, and it is a feature of all cells, both prokaryotic and eukaryotic. सेल मेम्ब्रेन जो है वो उसको हम प्लाज्मा झिल्ली भी कहते हैं और ये प्रोकैरियोटिक यूकैरियोटिक दोनों के अंदर पाई जाती है। और सेल मेम्ब्रेन जो होती है डबल लेयर मेम्ब्रेन होती है जो कि लिपिड और प्रोटीन की बनी हुई होती है और सेल को एनवायरनमेंट से अलग करती है। इट सेपरेट्स द साइटोप्लाज्म फ्रॉम द एक्सटर्नल एनवायरनमेंट। Membrane in biology, the thin layer that forms the outer boundary of a living cell or an internal cell compartment. The outer boundary is the plasma membrane, and the compartments enclosed by internal membrane are called organelles. Biological membranes have three primary functions. सबसे पहले मैंने आपको बताया कि मेम्ब्रेन को बायोलॉजी में हम कैसे डिफाइन करते हैं कि थिन लेयर होती है जो कि आउटर बाउंड्री बनाती है किसी भी लिविंग सेल की, जिसके अंदर सेल कंपार्टमेंट्स पाए जाते हैं। तो आउटर बाउंड्री तो होती है आपकी सेल मेम्ब्रेन और जो कंपार्टमेंट्स होते हैं वो होते हैं सेल मेम्ब्रेन। सो दिस बायोलॉजिकल मेम्ब्रेन हैज बेसिकली गॉट थ्री प्राइमरी फंक्शन, तीन चीफ कार्य होते हैं। दे कीप टॉक्सिक सब्सटेंस आउट ऑफ द सेल, टॉक्सिक सब्सटेंस को शरीर से बाहर निकालना। दे कंटेन रिसेप्टर्स एंड चैनल्स दैट अलाउ स्पेसिफिक मॉलिक्यूल्स such as ions, nutrients, waste, and metabolic products that mediate cellular and extracellular activity to pass between organelles and between the cell and the outside environment. And thirdly, they separate vital but incompatible metabolic processes conducted within organelles. Here you can see the structure of the plasma membrane, which I am going to tell you in the detail, but here you can see the picture. This is the outer face. Outer face is made up of the hydrophilic proteins, and the inner surface is made up of the hydrophobic proteins. In between there are intrinsic or integral proteins, and outside there is a sugar side chain. Now we'll discuss about the phospholipids of the plasma membrane. The membrane is partially made up of molecules called phospholipids, which spontaneously arrange in themselves into a double layer with hydrophilic or the water-loving. What is hydrophilic? Water-loving heads on the outside and hydrophobic or the water-hating tails on the inside. These interaction with water are what allow plasma membrane to form. Phospholipid जो होते हैं वो क्या होते हैं? Partially plasma membrane partially phospholipids की बनी हुई होती है और ये डबल लेयर के अंदर अरेंज होते हैं और इनके अंदर हाइड्रोफिलिक हेड्स और हाइड्रोफोरिक एंड्स पाए जाते हैं। प्रोटीन्स, सेल के अंदर कौन कौन से प्रोटीन्स हैं? प्रोटीन्स आर wedged between the lipid that make up the membrane, and these transmembrane proteins allow molecules that couldn't enter the cell otherwise to pass through by forming channels, pores, or gates. In this way, the cell controls the flow of these molecules as they enter and exit. Proteins in the cell membrane play an important role in many other functions such as cell signaling, cell recognition, and enzymatic activities. the carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are also found in the plasma membrane. Specifically, most carbohydrates in the membrane are part of glycoproteins, which are formed when a carbohydrate attaches to a protein. Glycoproteins play an important role in the interactions between cells, including cell addition, the process by which cells attach to each other. Here you can see the diagram of a cell where you can see the protein channels or the transport proteins, globular proteins, cholesterol, glycolipids, peripheral proteins, and these are the integral proteins, filament and surface proteins, various types of proteins in the cell membrane. Phospholipid bilayer. The cell membrane is made up of a phospholipid bilayer. Phospholipid are lipid molecules made up of a phosphate group, head, and two fatty acid टेल. फॉस्फोलिपिड्स काय काय के बने होते हैं? फॉस्फेट ग्रुप का हेड होता है इनके और इनके दो फैटी एसिड की टेल होती है. Importantly, the properties of phospholipid molecules allow them to spontaneously form a double layer membrane. The phosphate group head of a phospholipid is hydrophilic. Head जो होता है phosphate group का वो hydrophilic होता है और water living, whereas the phospholipid tail is hydrophobic. और जो phospholipid की जो tail होती है वो hydrophobic होती है या water hating होती है. This means that the phosphate group is attached to water where the tail is repelled by water. When in water or in aqueous solution, including inside the body, the hydrophobic heads of the phospholipids will orient themselves to be on the inside, as far away from the water as possible. In contrast, the hydrophilic heads will be on the outside. Hydrophilic head कहाँ पे है? बाहर की तरफ है. Making contact with the water, क्योंकि ये water loving है तो ये पानी के साथ contact में रहेंगे. और जो hydrophoric है वो पानी के contact में नहीं रहेंगे क्योंकि वो hydrophoric है. या water hating तो वो inside पाए जाते हैं. Membrane associated factors. In addition to the phospholipid bilayer, the cell membrane also contain lipid molecules. Lipids भी पाए जाते हैं cell membrane के अंदर, particularly glycolipids. किस तरह के lipid हैं? Glycolipids and sterols are the types of lipids which are found in the plasma membrane. One important sterol is cholesterol. कौन सा sterol पाया जाता है? Cholesterol, which regulate the fluidity of the cell membrane in animal cell. When there is less cholesterol, membrane becomes more fluid but also more permeable to molecules. The amount of cholesterol in the membrane help maintain its permeability so that the right amount of molecules can enter the cell at a time. The cell membrane also contains many different proteins. मैंने बताया था जैसा अभी डायग्राम में बताया कि बहुत तरह के प्रोटीन पाए जाते हैं and protein make up about half of the cell membrane और प्रोटीन सेल मेम्ब्रेन का half of the भाग बनाते हैं. Many of these proteins are transmembrane proteins which are embedded in the membrane but stick out on both the sides. They span across the entire lipid bilayer. सारी lipid bilayer के across proteins पाए जाते हैं. Some of these proteins are receptors. कुछ प्रोटीन्स ग्राही होते हैं which binds to signal molecule जो कि signal molecules के साथ जुड़े हुए होते हैं. Other are ion channels. कुछ ion channels होते हैं. Ion channels क्या करते हैं? Which are the only means of allowing ions in and out of the cell. Ion channels का काम क्या होता है कि वो केवल आयन को ही कोशिका झिल्ली के बाहर और अंदर आने जाने देते हैं. Scientists use the fluid mosaic model to describe the structure of the cell membrane. The cell membrane has a fluid consistency due to being made up of a large part of phospholipid, and because of this, protein move freely across its surface. The multitude of different proteins and lipids in the cell membrane give it the look of a mosaic. फ्लूइड मोज़ेक मॉडल के अंदर मैं प्रोटीन्स के बारे में कि प्रोटीन्स जो होते हैं वो फ्रीली सेल मेम्ब्रेन के अक्रॉस पाए जाते हैं. Membrane lipids. Now we'll talk about the membrane lipids. Membrane lipids are principally of two types. दो तरह के lipids हैं, phospholipid and sterols, generally cholesterol. Both types share the defining characters of lipids. They dissolve readily in organic solvent, but in addition, they both have a region that is attracted to and soluble in water. This this amphiphilic property, having a dual condition containing both a lipid-soluble and a water-soluble region, is basic to the role of lipid as building block of cellular membrane. Phospholipid molecules have a head of a glycerol to which are attached two long fatty acid chains that look like tails. These tails are repelled by water and dissolve readily in organic solvents, giving the molecule its lipid character. To another part of the head is attached a phosphoryl group with a negative electrical charge. To this group, in turn, is attached another group with a positive or neutral charge. This portion of the phospholipid dissolved in water, thereby completing the molecule's amphiphilic character. In contrast, sterols have a complex hydrocarbon ring structure as the lipid-soluble region and a hydroxyl grouping as the water-soluble region. This is the structure of a liposome. Glycerophospholipid structure, which is a structure of a liposome. What are liposomes? Phospholipids can be used to form artificial structure called liposome. Phospholipids जो है वो artificial structure का निर्माण करते हैं जिसको हम liposomes कहते हैं, which are double walled hollow sphere. दोहरे झिल्ली के होते हैं और खोखले होते हैं, useful for encapsulating other molecules such as pharmaceutical drugs. This type of lipid bilayer formed by the self-assembly of lipid molecule is the basic structure of the cell membrane. It is the most stable thermodynamic structure that is phospholipid water mixture can take up. The fatty acids portion of each molecules dissolved in the organic phase formed by the identical region of the other molecules and the water attractive region surrounded by water and facing away from the fatty acid regions. The chemical affinity of each region of the amphiphilic molecules is thus satisfied in the bilayer structure. Lipid bilayer cell membrane. Phospholipid molecules, like molecules of many lipids, are composed of a hydrophilic head and one or more hydrophobic tail. In a water medium, the molecules form a lipid bilayer or two-layered sheet in which the heads are turned towards the water medium and the tails are turned towards the inside of the membrane. Membrane protein. Membrane proteins are also of two general types. One type is called the extrinsic protein, which are loosely attached by ionic bonds or calcium bridges to the electrically charged phosphoryl surface of the bilayer. They can also attach to the second type of protein called the intrinsic proteins. The intrinsic proteins, as their name implies, are firmly embedded with the phospholipid bilayer. Almost all intrinsic proteins contain special amino acid sequences, generally about 20 to 24 amino acids long, that extend through the internal region of the cell membrane. Most intrinsic and extrinsic proteins bear on their outer surface side chains of the complex sugars which extend into the aqueous environment around the cell. For this reason, these proteins are often referred to as glycoproteins. Some glycoproteins are involved in cell-to-cell recognition, the cell matrix, and cell-to-cell communication. मेम्ब्रेन कार्बोहाइड्रेट्स कौन कौन से कार्बोहाइड्रेट्स होते हैं मेम्ब्रेन के अंदर सेल मेम्ब्रेन आर सेलेक्टिव बैरियर्स दैट सेपरेट इंडिविजुअल सेल एंड सेलुलर कंपार्टमेंट्स membranes are assemblies of carbohydrates proteins and lipids held together by binding forces काय की बनी हुई होती है झिल्ली कार्बोहाइड्रेट की प्रोटीन की और लिपिड्स की जो कि आपस में बाइंड रहते हैं किसी फोर्सेस के द्वारा कार्बोहाइड्रेट्स आर कोवेलेंटली लिंक्ड टू प्रोटीन्स कोवेलेंट बॉन्ड पाया जाता है सहसंयोजी बंध between proteins and carbohydrates or lipids and also an important part of the cell membrane and functions as adhesion and address loci for cell. The fluid mosaic model describes membranes as a fluid lipid bilayer with floating proteins and carbohydrates. Membrane carbohydrates are chemically bound to glycolipids and glycoproteins. However, some membrane carbohydrates are part of proteoglycans that insert their amino acid chain among the lipid fatty acids. Although some carbohydrates can be found associated with intracellular membranes, most of them are located in the outer monolayer of plasma membrane facing the extracellular space. Thank you.